Hi, I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to a special edition of Between the Covers. John Browne is my guest today. He is a Pittsburgh Tribune columnist, senior investment strategist at Euro-Pacific Capital, and a visiting fellow of the Heritage Foundation. He was raised on a family farm near Bath, England. He is a historian and economist. He graduated from the Harvard Business School, formerly with Morgan Stanley, and a member of Parliament. He now lives in Florida, and I am so pleased that you are my guest today on Between the Covers.
Well, thank you, Anne. That's a great, a very great pleasure for me.
It's interesting. This is a show about authors. We meet authors face to face, and what I did not mention is that you are also an author, and you have written a book of fiction, which is absolutely surprising to me with your background.
Even more surprising that it's romantic fiction.
A romantic historical fiction. How did you make that leap?
Well, it came as a dream, actually. I was invited to play in a golf tournament in Tuxedo Park. And after the first introductory round of the course, my host had a big limo to meet me at the airport. We had after dinner round a roaring fire with the air conditioners going flat out, noshing back the port. And I noticed this lovely book in his library called Lycus and Alexander, and I took it to bed, didn't put my lights out, read it till dawn. This happened about 2 or 3 nights in a row. And of course, my golf scores were going up and my performance was going down. I don't think I contributed a single hole, and we got the highest score in the tournament, the wooden spoon. My host was so furious that he sent me back on the train on Sunday instead of taking me back to New York on the Monday. And I was in the JetBlue aeroplane coming down here, of course, almost empty on a Monday morning in the summer. And I had 3 seats to sleep on, and I had my Bose noise cancelers on, and I was in this lovely subliminal half awake, half asleep thing, and I had this dream, and I rushed off the aeroplane and tapped out 28 chapter headings and a paragraph under each before I forgot it. And that was the foundation. It turned into being slightly longer when I got into the assassination of Rasputin and the MI6 role and all that stuff, but I mean, that was the basis of the book.
The book takes place 2003. Is that where it starts?
1913 to 1922.
Okay.
With flashbacks to 2003. I mean, the beginning of the book is today time, and then it goes back, and then comes back to the modern day.
Well, take us back and set the stage, if you will, for what's happening in the world then.
Well, I based it on a number of experiences of life, and my hero. Well, first of all, President Putin is coming to England on the first state visit since the emperor in 2003, and the Bank of England is ordered to surrender the money of any leftover Romanov accounts to the Russians, to sort of grease up to the Russians to make the visit successful. But the supervisor or director of one of the funds feels that this money, which belonged to the Empress, was from Queen Victoria and her father, the Duke of Hesse, and so it's never was Russian. And he resists, and he puts up a case, and the whole case is his research. And part of the research he uses is of a young Grenadier Guards officer who was caught in a girls' school when he was at school and expelled and pushed out. But of course, they wanted cannon fodder for the First World War, so eventually he got in the Grenadier Guards, and they follow his career through. Eventually ended up in the Somme, well, at Mons, of course, at the Somme, Ypres and Gauche Wood, and then he was badly wounded and then got back to England and then managed to get in the Royal Flying Corps as one of the beginners of the Royal Flying Corps. And so you've got the air battles and so on, and then he's much more badly wounded and invalided sort of out and put under MI6 control to try and go and rescue Romanovs after the terrible events of 1917 and 1918. And that's when the romantic history starts in the wastes of Siberia and St. Petersburg, well, Yekaterinburg and then Siberia, really.
And you told me that you fell in love yourself with your own heroine in the story.
Yes, it was slightly inconvenient because I did. She was such a wonderful girl. And I used to go to sleep thinking of her, and of course then I didn't want to end the book. So now it's far too long, probably, the book, but I didn't want to end because that was the end of her, really. It was sad.
You spoke about the Grenadier Guards, something you know quite a lot about.
Well, that was the regiment I was commissioned into from Sandhurst, which is the English equivalent of West Point. And I was commissioned into the Grenadier Guards, which is the senior of the Royal Guards regiments. And the Queen was the only, officially the only woman ever. It was formed just over 350 years ago. And she was the only woman ever to be in it until my heroine sneaked in.
Oh, good. Okay. I wonder what the Queen would think about this.
Well, she's got a copy of the book. I sent her a copy of the book. But she hasn't, she's very never gives opinions about things in public, so she hasn't written her opinion of the book.
You know the royal family.
Well, I know some of them, yes. I was lucky enough to play in, well, in the Royal Guard, you get to know them, sort of. Sometimes you're invited through when you're the officer of the guard, say at Windsor Castle or somewhere, to make up numbers. And I'll never forget one of my fellow officers went through, and because we were always sort of in mess kit on these ceremonial places, not in the jungle or the desert, but back in London, which is where all the girls were, which was one great advantage of being in the Guards. You were never in some way out place in England. You're always in London or abroad. And so often formally dressed for dinner that the regiment, to save officers the expense of white tie with a stiff white collar and all your laundry expenses, said you can wear soft collars for dinner. And so this chap was called through to make up numbers, and the Queen asked him and said, "Why are you wearing a soft collar?" And he said, well, ma'am, we only wear stiff collars now on special occasions." And so that, plus I was very lucky enough to play in Prince Philip's polo team with Prince Charles for a season or two, and that gave one sort of more access.
How did that come about?
Well, sort of polo and handicaps and things like that. My handicap fitted in the team structure and things like that, and it sort of all went from there, really.
That's such an interesting game. We do play it here in South Florida.
Oh, Wellington.
In Wellington, very physical
I
game.
played there years and years ago, 1970. No, what am I thinking about? I'm getting my decades muddled up now.
That's okay. That's understandable.
Yes, it was about 1970. I played down here at Gulfstream. First time I ever came to Palm Beach.
Is it the same game here as it is?
Yes, very much the same game. It's an international game, really, and a lot of the players, I've seen a lot of now the sons of my friends playing here at Wellington and things like that. Of course, the game, like everything since the Second World War, is elevated in standard. I mean, people are much better now than they were in my day because more money has been put into it. I mean, a horse that was $10,000, $15,000 cost in my day was a hugely expensive horse. Now they're 100,000 and 150,000. So
a little inflation.
Big business has poured huge amounts of money into it, and big patrons. And so the standard, it's like tennis, all these games, because people have had more time and more money from television, like rugby, football, and things like that, they've all gone up and up in standard because they're now much more professional in a way.
You also were in Parliament.
Yes, under Margaret Thatcher.
Under Margaret Thatcher. So
the whole of the Thatcher years. Oh, well, that was very thrilling. That was like being on board on the deck of HMS Victory at Trafalgar under Nelson. I mean, it was terrific. Margaret Thatcher was the fantastic leader, a person of principle, which we're sadly lacking now. And that's why she got on so well with Ronald Reagan, who I had the privilege of meeting 3 times, and Gorbachev. I had to look after Gorbachev, and I was...
How does one look after Gorbachev?
How did what?
How do you look after Gorbachev?
Well, I was told to be his... I know escort's the wrong word in America, but I was told to be his escort or liaison.
They got to be careful about
even for
that.
English public school boys. And I was his sort of liaison, I suppose. And just by sheer chance, it's these chances that float in the wind, really, I picked up that I thought he was going to be, from his body language and the body language of the other communists in the Lenin's museum and various things like that on the first day, that he was going to be the leader of the Soviet Union. And the only person, you know, our foreign secretary poured cold water all over it, and all the officials thought I was round the bend. Everyone thought it was nonsense until Margaret Thatcher. I had to brief that night. And she sat right forward on her chair and she said, "What?" You know, she was really interested. And then I briefed her each night, and then I was in the middle of I did all your morning programs, and ABC, forgotten what his name now is now, that used to sit on a stool. I've forgotten his name.
But you do look familiar to, I'm sure, a lot of our audience because you are on television all the time.
Yes, well, no, not all the time, but occasionally. But like this morning with Neil Cavuto, who's a wonderful interviewer. But it was, then she came out with this amazing statement, which was so exciting to be. You know, history goes into rich countries, poor countries, powerful countries, weak countries, and huge 30-year flows. And sometimes there's a complete fault line when the whole world changes on a dime. And this was it. And I was right in the center. I was in the middle of an NBC program. And they cut it short to go over to see Margaret Thatcher coming out after her first private meeting with Gorbachev, the only meeting that I didn't attend, actually. And I said, could I watch? And this was high tech in the 1985. The chap said from Washington, watch camera number 4 and I'll turn it on to you. I mean, that was amazing. And then she came out, the first question said, what do you think of Mr. Gorbachev, and Prime Minister? And she said, I think I can do business with this man. Well, the whole world turned on her, and that opened the door for Gorbachev to go to see President Reagan, ended the Cold War, and really was an amazing change in history to happen in one sentence. And it was so thrilling to be there present and to sort of being part of it in a way, and at having briefed her. And then I was called over to brief President Reagan, and of course he was the other person who really paid attention whilst the State Department poured cold water on all that I was saying. And then, of course, when he then became the leader, it all changed enormously. And actually in West Palm Beach, or in Palm Beach at the Four Arts, there was going to be an auction of President Reagan's letters, and I was asked if I wanted to bid for one, in which I was mentioned. But I couldn't afford, I'd probably go for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Oh, what a shame that you couldn't
Well,
have
luckily, some collector bought the entire collection,
okay.
So there was never an auction.
Oh.
So it's still saved in the collection by some huge collector.
Do you think that as Americans we have the correct opinion of Margaret Thatcher and her significance at the time?
Well, of course, she was pretty much to the right, and therefore very unpopular in large sections of the press. And of course, she was knifed down by, she made one big political mistake in a television interview of saying, well, they said, are you going to stand at the next election? She said, yes, I am, and the one after that, and the one after that. Well, of course, all her senior lieutenants were all ambitious to be the next leader. They thought, my God, if she stands that long, I'll be too old to be prime minister. So they knifed her down in a sea of political blood, knee deep, in the most disgraceful political assassination, really. And so it gave her a bad image. And she was one person who sort of came, you come in like me, rather overweight to your doctor, and he says, John, you've got to diet, and you've got to eat this and that, not that, and no chocolate and no cream and all that. And you think that's too tough, and you don't like the doctor. And so when she gave toughness to the British people, they actually had to work and do things and that, they didn't like her. So a lot of people hated her because they were guided by her ambitious lieutenants to hate her, and they didn't like the diet. And so then now we're all still fat.
Yeah.
And that was the sad thing, because she was, in my view, and I met Winston Churchill very briefly. He passed by me and my father in the House of Commons, and he mumbled, he said, good evening, and I mumbled, I was still in shorts as a schoolboy, and mumbled, good evening, brothers. And I think I've always been a Churchill fan, and think he was the greatest prime minister for 100 years. And I think Margaret Thatcher was equal to him, which was really quite something. She did the amazingly difficult things in peacetime, sort of easier to do in wartime when the whole thing is always justified if the government wants this, wants that. It gets done in wartime for the war effort. But in peacetime, it's much more difficult. And Margaret Thatcher succeeded in doing this. She revolutionized Britain. I mean, can you imagine when she came in, we were not allowed to own a telephone. It was illegal to own a telephone in England. You had to pay the post office 25% of its value a year in rent.
It was illegal to own a telephone?
Yes. You know, people forget what England was under socialism after the war. And the Conservatives were called ratchet. You know, you move further to the left, they just held the thing. They never moved it back. And so, you know, people forget what a revolution it was. You know, tax was 92%. It had gone up to 102% for 6 months before they realized the mistake. It was 92%. She reduced it to 40%, the top rate of tax. I mean,
that's hard for Americans to understand.
Well, we weren't allowed to take it. When I was a lad, you were allowed to take £5 out of England a year. You know, £5 is like $7.50. Right. And that's a year. And then it was increased to £250 a year after a lot of things. Margaret Thatcher just abolished foreign exchange controls, you know, just like that. I mean, it was the first budget. It was amazing. And she just did these things. And that's what shocked a lot of people who were mediocre, sort of pinko conservatives, sort of semi-socialists, who voted for her to get in because they didn't believe. They thought she was like all other politicians. She says this, but of course she'll never do it. And then she started doing the things she'd promised to do, absolutely shattered people. And of course, they then started to turn against her. And she was brought down not by the people in a general election, not even by her party in a party election, but by her closest lieutenants who stabbed her in the back, like Caesar.
I'm not sure I've ever heard the term semi-socialist, but I'm going to remember that. How many years were you in Parliament?
I was in for 14 years.
And when we think of Parliament, when we compare it to our government here, it is far more entertaining.
Well, it has got a... It's because of a very interesting thing, which I had to explain to Mr. Gorbachev. When the House of Commons was bombed in the war and was being rebuilt, and by then Winston Churchill was the father of the House, and he was asked, should I make it bigger to accommodate all the members? And he said, absolutely not. It must be exactly the same size, because that builds a sense of occasion. Because when there's a big speech, when there's an average speech, it looks pretty full. But when there's a big speech, the people sitting on the floors, on the steps of the gangways, and on the speakers sitting here in the chair, the Deputy Prime Minister and other people sitting on the steps of his throne. I mean, and so you think this is a fantastic occasion where there's not seating room anywhere and everybody's crowded in, and it builds a sense of occasion. Plus the fact it's the sort of people are watching all the time. If I'm known to be anti-Margaret Thatcher, for example, and I sit next to someone, I come and sit next to someone, because nobody has assigned seats. Just by custom, the person who's speaking gets next to the dispatch box, and his opposite number sits on the opposite dispatch box. And the chief whip and the shadow chief whip have pre-assigned seats. Otherwise, anybody can sit anywhere. And so if I come and sit down and I sit next to someone, and he cold shoulders me, they'll know, people watching will know, well, he's anti-Thatcher, so he must be pro, because he's cold shouldering. If he engages me in conversation, immediately he's also anti-Thatcher. So the whole thing on everybody's watching the other side to see who talks to who sits next to who, how they get on. It's all part of the morass. And of course it leads to very live debates, because people can sit in gangs.
That's an understatement, live debates. They are very heated debates.
And they're allowed to be pretty rude. Yeah. I mean, I've seen one minister have his speech torn up in front of him. I've seen another minister knocked cold on the floor and spread eagle like a crucifix in the middle of the floor. And he was picked up by friends who picked him up under the armpits, you know, and put him on the, and he sort of slapped his face as he went, oh, he had far too good a dinner. And so it's been, you know, I've seen one minister die at the dispatch box of a heart attack. It can be a pretty rough place. And of course, Margaret Thatcher's end was very, very sad too.
Yeah, truly. You've lived in America long enough to know that we are absolutely fascinated with anything royal. What do you think is the fascination for us?
Well, I don't really know. I'm an Anglo-American now, with an American passport and a British passport. I'm not American enough to know really the answer to that, except that I think it's rather this, you know, Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali had charisma because before they went in the ring. Sonny Liston didn't, but his charisma was built on winning fights. And the Queen had very little charisma, not a great speaker and everything, but she kept on winning fights every time. She just did the right thing, never put a foot wrong, and has come up to people think, my gosh, that's the person who's so well groomed, so well behaved and everything, perfect behavior, that it begins to build a huge charisma. And people criticized her in the old days of not dressing well enough for Yves Saint Laurent and all that sort of thing. But she wasn't dressing for the rich. She was dressing for Middle England. so that a woman watching on television or a film could say, my gosh, I saw that dress in Marks and Spencer. I can go and get it. It may not be the same material, but the style was the same. And so she was dressing. It's been so successful that they had a popularity contest in England at the time of the Olympics. I think it was 2012. And the first person was won by David Attenborough, who is the person on the nature films, and he whispers into the microphone as two butterflies are copulating, and he's saying, now you see the male butterfly, and he's written the whole of England's on its seat, edge of its seats, trying to listen to his whisper, and he was the most popular. The number 2 was the Queen. She was the second most popular person in the country. No, the only other people in the first 10 were Prince William and Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge. They were the only other 2. They were like 7 and 8. Bend it like Beckham, the football player, and all these people were in it. Music players, singers, and everything. No other member of the royal family, but the Queen was number 2. I mean, it was fantastic. So she's genuinely popular, and she's not only respected, but deeply loved by people. And I don't know how she does it. I mean, the charisma, you know, it's a difficult thing to define anyway, but she certainly has done it. And I think that leads to a fascination. And the fact that such a powerful, you know, the Queen has huge constitutional powers, like she's the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Every single officer who serves in the British Army and non-commissioned doesn't swear allegiance to the country, the Crown, or Parliament, but to the Queen in person. So if a Queen dies, heaven forbid, they swear to the new king. They don't swear to the country at all. All the officer corps and everything. So she's Commander-in-Chief means something. The only person who can open and close Parliament. The only person who can sign a bill in Parliament into an Act of Parliament. The only person who can appoint bishops, ambassadors, and even ministers. She's the only person constitutionally who can do it. She even has her own spy in Parliament, paid for by the taxpayer. Everybody knows who he is. It's never been a woman yet. Everyone knows who he is, but no one knows what he says.
Ah.
No one knows. He writes every night to the Queen a handwritten letter. And a messenger comes with a leather bag with a padlock on it. He puts it in there. There's no secretary used to type it, so it's all written in hand. And it's taken to the Queen direct. Nobody ever knows.
So the Queen doesn't have email then, I'm guessing.
Oh, yes, I'm pretty sure she does. Never emailed me, but I'm pretty sure she does, yes. Those younger princes will have got her onto the email. This is handwritten deliberately so no one can see it, what her spy says. So the Prime Minister comes to visit her, say at Balmoral on a Tuesday, and stays the night, and she says, what about this? And he says, oh, there'll be no problem, Ma'am, you know, I've got this and we'll do that. He doesn't know what his spy sitting behind him has said, that actually the Prime Minister's got a lot of difficulty in getting this through. And so it means that the Prime Minister, when he briefs the Queen, is very loath to lie, which is strange to some politicians.
Very interesting. What a great job to be the spy to the Queen.
Oh, yeah. It's called the Messages Whip. You can look him up on Google and see who it is at the moment. I mean,
well, there are spies as well. The MI6 is in your new book, Hidden Account of the Romanovs.
Yes, and it's basically about the first part of the book is the First World War, as I was telling you. The second part of the book, when the hero is sent to Russia, and you've got the assassination, the build-up to the assassination of the imperial family, and then the events after that. And in the first half, of course, you've got the MI6 organized assassination of Rasputin, which, of course, was done under Russian colors. Prince Yusupov was there, Grand Duke Dmitry was there, all the people that are known were all there. But the 2 British officers that were dressed in Russian overcoats, because the British overcoats were so flimsy, that every British officer in St. Peter's wore a Russian coat, which was fleece-lined. And so there's cold winters. And so they were mistaken for Russian officers by the police, but they're actually 2 MI6 agents. We know who one is, Major Oswald Rayner, who owned up on his deathbed in Oxford, but no one will never know who the second one was. And they believe it was the second one because the poison was military and old, so it didn't work. They've had enough poison to kill 11 people. It still made him froth at the mouth and all that, Rasputin, but he didn't die. They beat him up terribly, so one eye was hanging out, one ear was hanging off and everything. They shot him twice at 20 centimeters range, twice, and he still wouldn't die. And so eventually this British agent was, now the new theory is, was pulled out a much heavier weapon, a .44, a .455 Webley pistol, which was a much bigger shot than the Russian pistols, and went through his head. But the whole history, the hole in his head, was too small for the British bullet, until when they had the laying up of the bones in St. Peter and Paul in about 1998, I think it was. The head of forensic science in Russia, invited his American and British opposite numbers to finish the investigation of Rasputin's death, which was never concluded. And the American said he was too busy, so left. But the British guy stayed, and they discovered with the modern analysis of the photographs that were taken immediately after he was assassinated the next day, that there were 2 hairline fractures leading from the hole. So if you pushed this piece of bone in, the hole was big enough for the British bullet. And that was the breakthrough, really.
And the rest we're going to have to read in the book. It is Hidden Account of the Romanovs. John Browne.
And it's on Amazon.
On
Amazon. And it's on, Amazon's the cheapest, by far the cheapest. and of course it's e-copy as well. But the problem is it's a very big book, because I couldn't put it down. I fell in love with heroin.
I know we are going to love every
on and on
word.
writing.
Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you very much. It's been the greatest pleasure.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I'm Ann Bocock, and for more on the story, tune in to the next Between the Covers.